The village of Hazelbrook lay wrapped in a soft, deceptive calm as Christmas Eve approached. Snow rested gently on the rooftops, hedges and narrow lanes, giving the illusion of peace and goodwill. Windows glowed with warm candlelight, wreaths hung neatly on doors, and the distant sound of church bells echoed faintly through the cold air. Yet beneath the festive beauty, Hazelbrook harbored secrets, old resentments, unspoken rivalries, and memories that refused to remain buried. Those who lived there understood that silence in Hazelbrook was rarely innocent. Miss Jane Marple arrived in the village just before dusk, stepping carefully from the carriage onto the snow-covered path. She was bundled in a modest coat, her posture upright, her eyes alert and quietly observant. To most, she appeared to be nothing more than a gentle elderly lady visiting friends for the holidays. Few would have guessed that behind her calm expression lay a mind sharpened by years of understanding human nature in its most dangerous forms. Miss Marple had learned long ago that evil rarely announced itself loudly. More often, it whispered politely over tea. Hazelbrook Manor stood at the edge of the village, an imposing structure softened by Christmas decorations and ivy creeping along its stone walls. It was there that Miss Marple had been invited to spend the holiday by her old friend, Eleanor Whitcomb, a woman of means and influence whose family history was deeply entwined with the village. Eleanor's letter had been warm and welcoming, yet something in its tone had troubled Miss Marple, a faint urgency, a careful avoidance of certain details. Experience told her that such letters often concealed more than they revealed. Inside the manor, preparations for Christmas were underway. Servants moved briskly through the halls, laying out decorations, arranging garlands, and preparing the dining room for the holiday gathering. Laughter drifted from the sitting room, but Miss Marple noticed how it faltered when certain names were mentioned. She took note of this immediately. People often revealed more through what they avoided than through what they said outright. Eleanor greeted Miss Marple with affection, though her smile wavered just slightly. The two women exchanged pleasantries, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the tension in Eleanor's hands, the way her fingers twisted together before she composed herself. "It's so good to see you, Jane," Eleanor said warmly. "Christmas in Hazelbrook is always memorable." The pause before the final word did not go unnoticed. As evening fell, guests began to arrive, family members, old acquaintances, and a few villagers invited out of tradition rather than fondness. Each carried themselves with the politeness expected of the season, yet beneath their courteous manners lay unspoken histories. Miss Marple observed them quietly from her chair near the fire, knitting needles moving steadily as her eyes drifted from face to face. She noticed the sharp glance exchanged between two cousins, the stiff formality of a brother greeting his sister, and the way one guest lingered too long by the doorway. As though measuring exits rather than admiring decorations, conversation turned to harmless topics: weather, travel difficulties, childhood Christmases. Yet every so often, the dialogue faltered, shadows passing briefly over faces when past events were hinted at. Miss Marple knew these signs well. She had seen them in countless villages, in countless drawing rooms, where tragedy had once seemed impossible. People believed Christmas softened hearts, but she knew it often sharpened old wounds instead. Later that night, as snow began to fall more heavily, Miss Marple retired to her room. The manor was quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood and the distant hum of voices below. She sat by the window for a time, gazing out at the village lights. Hazelbrook looked peaceful, almost fragile beneath its white covering. And yet, Miss Marple felt the unmistakable sense that something was wrong, that a secret long concealed was nearing the point of exposure. Downstairs, a heated conversation erupted briefly before being silenced. Miss Marple heard the raised voices, followed by an abrupt quiet. It was the kind of silence that followed a statement that could not be taken back. She closed her book gently, her mind already at work. Secrets, she knew, did not simply vanish. They waited, and when they emerged, they often did so with devastating consequences. Christmas morning arrived cold and bright. The manor buzzed with activity, but the atmosphere had shifted. Smiles were strained, movements cautious. One guest failed to appear for breakfast, and concern was dismissed too quickly by others. Miss Marple noticed the hurried glances, the way servants avoided a particular corridor. She said nothing, merely sipped her tea and listened. It was only when a scream shattered the fragile calm that the truth could no longer be ignored. The body was discovered in the study position too neatly, too deliberately, to be accidental. The room smelled faintly of pine and old paper, Christmas cards scattered across the desk like mocking reminders of goodwill. Miss Marple stood at the threshold, her expression grave but composed. She had seen this before, though never did it lose its power to disturb her. As the household descended into confusion and whispered accusations, Miss Marple remained quietly observant. She understood, perhaps better than anyone present, that the murder was not the beginning of the story. It was the result, a consequence of something far older, far deeper, a Christmas secret that had finally demanded its price. And as snow continued to fall over Hazelbrook, Miss Marple began to knit together the threads of truth. Knowing that before the holiday ended, the final clue would reveal itself, and with it, the identity of the killer. The discovery of the body cast a long shadow over Hazelbrook Manor, one that no amount of candlelight or Christmas cheer could dispel. The guests were gathered in the drawing room, their voices hushed, movements restrained, as though any sudden action might shatter what little order remained. Snow continued to fall outside, soft and relentless, sealing the manor from the rest of the world. Miss Marple sat quietly near the fireplace, her knitting resting in her lap, observing the scene with calm attentiveness. Panic, she knew, revealed truths more readily than interrogation. The victim, Gerald Whitcomb, had been Eleanor's cousin, a man of sharp intellect and sharper tongue. His presence in Hazelbrook had never gone unnoticed, nor had it been universally welcomed. Whispers traveled quickly through the room as details emerged. Gerald had been found alone in the study, seated at his desk, a look of surprise frozen upon his face. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious weapon. The door had been closed, though not locked. To some it seemed peaceful. To Miss Marple, it seemed deliberate. Eleanor Whitcomb was pale, her composure held together by sheer force of will. She insisted on informing the local authorities, though the heavy snowfall meant help would be delayed. Until then, the household was left in a state of uneasy limbo. Miss Marple watched as Eleanor gave instructions to the servants, her voice steady yet distant. Grief, Miss Marple reflected, often wore many disguises: shock, denial, and sometimes a peculiar sense of relief. As the guests settled into their enforced confinement, conversations resumed in cautious fragments. Miss Marple listened closely, noting the subtle shifts in tone. Gerald's name surfaced repeatedly, often followed by abrupt changes of subject. Some spoke of him with fond nostalgia, recalling childhood Christmases and shared memories. Others were less generous, their praise faintly tinged with resentment. Miss Marple paid special attention to these inconsistencies. In small villages and old families, history was never forgotten, only suppressed. She soon learned that Gerald had arrived unexpectedly 2 days before Christmas, claiming business matters required his presence. This explanation, however, did not sit well with everyone. One guest mentioned a heated argument the previous evening, dismissed quickly as a family disagreement. Another recalled seeing Gerald late at night, pacing the corridor outside the study. Each recollection added weight to the growing sense that his death was not as sudden or inexplicable as it first appeared. Miss Marple gently engaged those around her, asking seemingly innocent questions. She inquired about the layout of the manor, the routines of the household, and Gerald's habits during his stay. Her tone was mild, her curiosity framed as concern rather than suspicion. People often underestimated her, mistaking her politeness for naivety. She allowed this misconception to persist, knowing it encouraged others to speak more freely. One detail stood out almost immediately. Several guests mentioned a locked cabinet in the study, one that Gerald had insisted on examining shortly after his arrival. Its contents were said to be old documents, family records, and letters dating back decades. The cabinet was now found open, its contents disturbed. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Old papers, she knew, had a way of resurrecting buried truths, especially when money, inheritance, or reputation were involved. As the morning wore on, tensions escalated. Accusations were not spoken outright, but they lingered in glances and silences. A young niece avoided eye contact with her uncle's widow. A distant cousin grew defensive when questioned about his whereabouts the previous night. Miss Marple observed it all, mentally arranging each behavior into patterns she recognized all too well. People reacted predictably when confronted with guilt or fear of exposure. During a quiet moment, Miss Marple requested permission to see the study. Eleanor hesitated before agreeing, though she accompanied Miss Marple herself. The room was orderly, almost unnaturally so. Christmas cards lined the mantel, cheerful messages mocking the grim reality of the scene. Miss Marple examined the desk, the chair, and the papers scattered across the surface. Nothing appeared overtly violent, yet everything felt staged, as though someone had wanted the death to appear peaceful. Her eyes lingered on a half-burned letter in the fireplace. The handwriting was elegant but forceful, the remaining words hinting at betrayal and long-held grievances. Miss Marple felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Letters, she knew, were often the most dangerous objects of all. They preserved emotion, accusation, and proof in ways memory could not distort. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found the guests increasingly restless. The isolation imposed by the storm heightened every emotion. Christmas decorations now felt oppressive, their cheerfulness bordering on cruel irony. Miss Marple sensed that the truth lay not in the moment of death, but in events set into motion long before Gerald ever arrived at Hazelbrok. As evening approached, she reflected on the pattern she had observed throughout her life. Murders, especially within families, were rarely about sudden rage. They were about secrets carefully hidden, fiercely protected. And Christmas, with its forced togetherness and emphasis on tradition, had a way of exposing fractures long ignored. Miss Marple glanced once more around the room, her expression gentle, almost sympathetic. She already suspected that Gerald's death was the culmination of a secret too dangerous to remain concealed. Someone in Hazelbrok had feared its revelation more than they feared committing murder. And as night fell once again over the snowbound manor, Miss Marple knew that the real investigation was only beginning. The cabinet in the study became the quiet center of Hazelbrok Manor's unease. Though no one spoke of it openly, Miss Marple sensed that nearly every thought, every furtive glance, eventually returned to that single piece of furniture. It stood against the far wall of the study, dark wood polished to a dull sheen, its doors slightly ajar as if disturbed in haste. The servants avoided it, and Eleanor Whitcomb had ordered the room closed. Yet curiosity and fear lingered like a scent in the air. Miss Marple requested another visit to the study the following morning. Eleanor agreed reluctantly, her expression betraying both exhaustion and apprehension. The snow outside had eased, but the cold remained, seeping into the manor's stone walls. As Miss Marple stepped inside, she felt the familiar stillness of a room that had witnessed a turning point, where words on paper had likely carried more weight than any weapon. The cabinet's contents had been partially removed. Folders lay scattered on a nearby table, their labels faded with age. Miss Marple examined them carefully, her movements deliberate. Birth records, property deeds, correspondence between family members long deceased. Each document was a fragment of a story spanning generations. She noticed that certain papers appeared newer, placed deliberately among the older files. Someone, it seemed, had wanted them to be found. As she studied the documents, Miss Marple recalled the patterns she had seen countless times before. Families often buried inconvenient truths under layers of respectability, hoping time would erase them. But time, she knew, had a way of preserving secrets rather than destroying them. And when such secrets resurfaced, they rarely did so gently. Eleanor stood nearby, silent. When Miss Marple gently inquired about the papers, Eleanor's composure faltered. She admitted that Gerald had demanded access to the cabinet shortly after arriving, claiming there were discrepancies in the family records that required immediate attention. He had been insistent, almost aggressive. Miss Marple noted the choice of words carefully. Insistence often masked desperation. Later, Miss Marple sought out the other guests individually, engaging them in quiet conversation. She learned that Gerald had been estranged from much of the family for years. His return met with mixed reactions. Some resented his interference, others feared what he might uncover. One cousin mentioned that Gerald had hinted at a revelation that would change everything. Another recalled him speaking cryptically about justice long delayed. These remarks confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Gerald had not come to Hazelbrook merely for business. He had come armed with knowledge powerful, enough to unsettle those who had built their lives on carefully constructed lies. As the day progressed, Miss Marple noticed the strain growing more pronounced. One guest, Margaret Whitcomb, avoided the study entirely, her unease apparent whenever Gerald's name was mentioned. Another, Henry Whitcomb, reacted with thinly veiled hostility when Miss Marple asked about inheritance matters. Each response added a new thread to the tapestry of motive. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned briefly to the study alone. Her eyes were drawn again to the fireplace, where remnants of ash still clung to the grate. She sifted through them gently, uncovering fragments of burned paper. Though the text was mostly illegible, a few words remained: dates, names, and a phrase that suggested concealment. Enough, she knew, to frighten someone profoundly. Miss Marple considered the nature of Gerald's death. The absence of violence suggested poison, subtle, controlled, and personal. Poisoning required planning, familiarity, and access. It was not a crime of impulse, but of intent. And intent, in her experience, was often born of fear rather than hatred. As evening fell, the household gathered once more. The storm had isolated them physically, but emotionally they were more divided than ever. Miss Marple watched as alliances shifted, as whispered conversations ended abruptly when others approached. The festive decorations now seemed grotesque, their brightness mocking the darkness beneath. Miss Marple reflected on the cabinet and its secrets. Someone had known what Gerald was about to reveal. Someone had acted to prevent it. The murder was not simply an act of silencing. It was an attempt to preserve a carefully maintained illusion. And yet, Miss Marple also knew that secrets, once disturbed, rarely remained hidden for long. The cabinet had been opened. The documents had been touched. The past had already begun to assert itself. As she retired for the night, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The key to the crime lay not in who had the means to kill, but in who had the most to lose. And somewhere among the papers, the ashes, and the strained faces in the drawing room, the truth waited patiently to be uncovered. By the fourth day, Hazelbrook Manor had settled into a tense rhythm, one shaped by fear, suspicion, and the weight of unspoken truths. The snow had sealed the estate from the outside world, and with no immediate arrival of authorities, the household existed in an uneasy isolation. Miss Marple sensed that this confinement was amplifying emotions, drawing out behaviors that might otherwise have remained concealed. It was in such circumstances, she knew, that the smallest details often proved decisive. The morning tea ritual resumed, more out of habit than comfort. Guests gathered in the dining room, porcelain cups arranged with meticulous care, the scent of brewing tea filling the air. Miss Marple observed the scene with particular interest. Tea, she reflected, was an intimate custom, one that required trust. And trust, once broken, left behind opportunities for subtle cruelty. As she accepted her cup, Miss Marple noticed a faint hesitation among the guests. Hands trembled slightly, eyes darted toward the teapot. Someone declined tea altogether, citing nerves. Another sipped cautiously, as though expecting the liquid to betray them. These reactions confirmed what Miss Marple had already begun to suspect. Gerald's death had not been as peaceful as it appeared. Poison was a silent weapon, favored by those who wished to avoid confrontation. Miss Marple recalled the previous evening's conversations. Gerald had been seen drinking tea in the study shortly before his death, prepared by one of the household staff at Eleanor's request. The cup had been removed before anyone thought to examine it. A small oversight, perhaps, but one that now loomed large. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire discreetly about the preparation of that final drink. Later, she spoke with the maid responsible for serving tea that night. The young woman was nervous, her words tumbling over one another as she insisted she had followed the usual routine. Miss Marple listened patiently, offering gentle reassurance. It was not the maid's demeanor that interested her, but a small inconsistency in her account. She mentioned being interrupted while preparing the tray, leaving it unattended for a brief moment. Long enough, Miss Marple thought, for someone determined to act. The study itself yielded further clues. Miss Marple noticed a faint residue at the bottom of Gerald's teacup, nearly invisible to the untrained eye. The smell was subtle, masked by the tea's aroma. Certain poisons, she knew, were chosen precisely for such qualities. They were efficient, discreet, and difficult to detect without careful analysis. As suspicion deepened, the guests' interactions grew increasingly strained. Accusations remained unspoken, but the tension was palpable. Miss Marple paid particular attention to who avoided whom, who spoke too quickly, who seemed eager to establish alibis without being asked. These behaviors often revealed guilt or fear, though not always in obvious ways. Margaret Whitcomb, in particular, drew Miss Marple's attention. She appeared deeply unsettled, her composure fraying whenever Gerald's name arose. Miss Marple recalled her earlier reluctance to discuss the cabinet and its contents. Now Margaret avoided the tea table entirely, her anxiety manifesting in sleepless nights and erratic behavior. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, was often mistaken for guilt, but it could also be the fear of exposure rather than of punishment. Henry Whitcomb, on the other hand, seemed almost defiant. He spoke openly of Gerald's manipulative tendencies, framing the deceased as a disruptive force. His tone suggested justification rather than grief. Miss Marple noted this carefully. People who felt wronged often rationalized extreme actions by casting their victims as villains. That afternoon, Miss Marple revisited the burned letter fragments. One phrase lingered in her mind, a reference to an altered will. Inheritance disputes were fertile ground for resentment, especially when combined with long-standing secrets. Gerald's return, she suspected, had threatened to unravel more than reputations. It had endangered livelihoods. As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, knitting steadily. She appeared absorbed in her work, yet her mind was fully engaged. The method of murder was becoming clearer. The opportunity had been present. The motive, though still obscured, was taking shape around the cabinet's secrets. Miss Marple understood that poison was chosen not merely for its effectiveness, but for what it symbolized. It allowed the killer to act without facing their victim, to preserve a sense of detachment. It was, in a way, the ultimate expression of fear, and as the household prepared for another uneasy night, Miss Marple felt certain that the truth was edging closer to the surface. Someone at Hazelbrook Manor had placed poison in Gerald Whitcomb's tea, believing that by silencing him, they could protect a secret meant never to be revealed. But secrets, Miss Marple knew, were never so easily buried. The letter emerged quietly, almost by accident, as though it had waited patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. Miss Marple discovered it while examining a stack of old books in the Manor's small library, a room seldom used and rarely disturbed. One volume, its spine cracked with age, felt unusually heavy. When she opened it, a folded sheet of yellowed paper slipped free and landed softly at her feet. Miss Marple picked it up with care. The handwriting was unmistakable, firm, deliberate, and unmistakably Gerald Whitcomb's. The date, written neatly at the top, preceded his arrival at Hazelbrook by several weeks. As Miss Marple read, her expression grew thoughtful. The letter was not addressed, but its contents were clear enough. Gerald spoke of a discovery made among the family papers, one that altered his understanding of the Whitcomb legacy entirely. The letter referenced a child born out of wedlock, quietly removed from the family's official history. It suggested that inheritance rights had been deliberately redirected, fortunes built upon a carefully maintained falsehood. Miss Marple felt the familiar chill that accompanied such revelations. Illegitimacy, she knew, had destroyed reputations and families far more effectively than any crime. What struck her most was the letter's tone. Gerald did not sound triumphant. Instead, he seemed conflicted, torn between a sense of justice and an awareness of the damage his revelation would cause. He wrote of confronting certain family members, of offering them a chance to acknowledge the truth before he made it public. Miss Marple sighed softly. Such offers, however well-intentioned, often invited desperation. Miss Marple folded the letter and returned it carefully to the book. She did not yet reveal her discovery. Experience had taught her that truth, introduced too abruptly, could provoke reckless behavior. Instead, she observed the household anew, viewing each interaction through the lens of the letter's contents. It was now clear that Gerald's return had been no coincidence. He had come armed with proof, prepared to force a reckoning. Miss Marple recalled the unease surrounding the cabinet, the burned fragments in the fireplace, and the tension that flared whenever inheritance was mentioned. All these signs pointed toward a single conclusion. Someone had stood to lose everything if Gerald spoke. That afternoon, Miss Marple engaged Eleanor in a quiet conversation. She spoke gently of the past, of how families often carried burdens from one generation to the next. Eleanor listened, her expression guarded. When Miss Marple alluded, ever so delicately, to the possibility of family secrets affecting inheritance, Eleanor's composure slipped. The moment passed quickly, but it was enough. Later, Miss Marple spoke with Margaret Whitcomb. The younger woman appeared exhausted, her nerves frayed by days of strain. When Miss Marple mentioned Gerald's discovery of certain documents, Margaret broke down, confessing that she had known fragments of the truth for years. She claimed she had begged Gerald not to pursue the matter, fearing the devastation it would bring. Miss Marple listened, her sympathy genuine, yet her mind remained analytical. Knowledge alone did not equate to guilt, but it did establish motive. As evening approached, Miss Marple considered the implications of the letter. It explained Gerald's urgency, his confrontations, and the desperation that now permeated the manor. It also narrowed the field of suspects considerably. Only those whose inheritance or social standing depended upon the secret's concealment would have reason to act so decisively. The letter also suggested something more troubling. Gerald had planned to reveal the truth on Christmas Day, believing the symbolism appropriate, a moment of honesty, reconciliation, and renewal. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Christmas, she reflected, was often chosen for such revelations, under the mistaken belief that goodwill would soften the blow. As night fell, Miss Marple felt the investigation nearing its climax. The method of murder had been subtle. The motive, though complex, was now clear. All that remained was to identify the individual who had transformed fear into fatal resolve. And as Hazelbrook Manor settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple held the letter close, knowing it was the key to unraveling the crime and to exposing the Christmas secret that had killed by the 6th day. The strain at Hazelbrook Manor had become impossible to ignore. Sleep came fitfully, conversations were clipped, and every sound echoed a little too loudly through the halls. Miss Marple observed these changes with quiet attention. Fatigue, she knew, loosened the careful control people maintained over their stories. It was often exhaustion, not interrogation, that revealed the truth. The question of alibis had arisen naturally, though no one spoke of it openly. Guests volunteered information without being asked, eager to place themselves far from the study on the night of Gerald's death. Miss Marple listened politely, committing each account to memory. Patterns soon emerged. Several alibis overlapped too neatly, relying on shared recollections that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. One account, in particular, troubled her. Margaret Whitcomb claimed she had been in the sitting room with Eleanor throughout the evening, engaged in a long conversation by the fire. Eleanor confirmed this readily, almost too quickly. Miss Marple noted the subtle tension between the two women. Their eyes rarely met, their agreement strained by an undercurrent of unease. Mutual alibis, she knew, were often born of necessity rather than truth. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took Eleanor aside. Her manner was gentle, her questions framed as concern rather than suspicion. She asked about the evening's timeline, about when tea had been served and who had come and gone. Eleanor's responses were careful, precise and inconsistent. A detail altered slightly with each retelling, a small shift in sequence that betrayed uncertainty. Miss Marple said nothing, but her conclusion was firm. Eleanor was protecting someone, perhaps even herself. Miss Marple then turned her attention to Henry Whitcomb. His alibi rested on a solitary walk taken during the storm, an implausible choice given the weather. He claimed to have sought solitude, yet no one could confirm his whereabouts for nearly an hour. When Miss Marple gently questioned him, Henry grew defensive, his irritation thinly veiled. Such behavior, Miss Marple reflected, often masked fear of exposure rather than innocence. As she reviewed the accounts, Miss Marple returned again and again to the moment the tea tray had been left unattended. That brief window of opportunity aligned uncomfortably well with the inconsistency she had observed. Someone had needed only a minute, just long enough to act unseen. That evening, Miss Marple staged a quiet test. She mentioned casually, over dinner, that she believed Gerald had been poisoned earlier in the evening than initially thought. The reaction was immediate. Margaret stiffened, her fork pausing mid-air. Eleanor paled visibly. Henry scoffed too loudly, dismissing the idea with forced confidence. Miss Marple took careful note. Truth, she knew, often announced itself through reflex rather than reason. Later, alone in her room, Miss Marple reconstructed the night in her mind. Gerald had confronted certain family members earlier that day. He had intended to reveal the truth on Christmas morning. Fear had escalated into desperation. The poison had been administered quietly, efficiently, by someone who knew exactly what was at stake. The false alibi now stood out clearly. Margaret's presence in the sitting room had been exaggerated. Eleanor's confirmation was an act of loyalty or guilt. Miss Marple suspected that Margaret had slipped away briefly, long enough to act, then returned to resume the appearance of normality. It was a small deception, but one with devastating consequences. Yet Miss Marple hesitated. Motive and opportunity aligned, but something remained unresolved. Margaret's fear seemed genuine, but was it fear of punishment or of disgrace? Miss Marple reminded herself that the truth was rarely simple. Often, more than one person shared responsibility. If not for the act itself, then for the silence that followed. As night settled once more over Hazelbrook Manor, Miss Marple felt the investigation drawing inexorably toward its conclusion. The false alibi had been exposed, even if only in her own mind. The next step would require careful handling. Accusations made too soon could drive the guilty into denial or worse, and so Miss Marple waited, patient as ever, knowing that the final clue would soon demand to be acknowledged. By the seventh day, the truth hovered just beneath the surface at Hazelbrook Manor, close enough to be felt, but not yet spoken. Miss Marple sensed it in the way conversation stalled, in the careful avoidance of certain topics, and in the quiet dread that lingered in every room. She had reached that familiar stage of an investigation where all the pieces were present, awaiting only their final arrangement. The final clue presented itself in the most unassuming manner. Miss Marple noticed it during the afternoon tea ritual that had become a source of collective anxiety. As the teapot was passed, she observed Margaret Whitcomb hesitate, her eyes fixed on the china as though it were capable of betrayal. Miss Marple watched closely as Margaret adjusted her napkin, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Such reactions, Miss Marple knew, were rarely accidental. Her mind returned to the earlier discovery of the letter and the false alibi. The fear Margaret displayed was not that of a cold-blooded killer, but of someone who had acted in desperation to prevent a catastrophe. Miss Marple reflected on the letter's contents once more. The secret Gerald had uncovered would not merely alter inheritance, it would destroy reputations carefully built over decades. For someone like Margaret, whose identity and security depended upon that illusion, exposure would have felt unbearable. Miss Marple recalled a small but crucial detail: Margaret's familiarity with herbal remedies and household preparations. It had been mentioned casually, almost proudly, in conversation earlier in the week. Such knowledge would make the administration of poison both accessible and subtle. Miss Marple also remembered the moment the tea tray had been left unattended, the precise window Margaret could have used. Yet what confirmed Miss Marple's conclusion was not these facts alone, but Margaret's behavior following Gerald's death. Rather than relief, she displayed a persistent, gnawing anxiety. She avoided the study, the cabinet, and any mention of the letter. Guilt, Miss Marple reflected, often manifested not as defiance, but as relentless fear of discovery. That evening, Miss Marple requested that everyone gather in the drawing room. Her tone was calm, her demeanor composed. She spoke not of accusation, but of understanding. She described the nature of secrets, how they fester when concealed, and how fear could drive even the most unlikely individuals to commit irrevocable acts. As she spoke, the room grew still. Miss Marple outlined the sequence of events with precision: the confrontation, the threat of revelation, the unattended tea tray, the false alibi. She did not yet name the culprit. Instead, she allowed the narrative to build, knowing that the truth, once articulated, often compelled confession. When she finally turned to Margaret, her voice remained gentle. She spoke of desperation rather than malice, of fear rather than hatred. Margaret's composure collapsed. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed, her words tumbling out in a mixture of regret and anguish. She admitted to poisoning Gerald's tea, believing she had no other way to prevent the destruction of her family's name. The room erupted in shock, though Miss Marple noted that Eleanor's reaction was subdued, tinged with a sorrow that suggested prior knowledge. It became clear that Eleanor had suspected the truth and had chosen silence, complicit through omission. Miss Marple acknowledged this with a quiet sadness. Crimes, she knew, were rarely committed in isolation. Margaret's confession brought a strange calm to the manor. The secret had been exposed, its power diminished by truth. Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a familiar melancholy. Another life lost. Another family shattered by fear and deception. As authorities were finally able to reach Hazelbrook, Miss Marple prepared herself for the final act of the tragedy. Justice would be served, but it would not undo the damage wrought by years of concealment. And as the snow continued to fall outside, Miss Marple reflected that the final clue had never been a physical object at all. It had been the quiet, persistent fear of a woman trapped by a sick morning broke over Hazelbrook Manor with a fragile stillness, the kind that follows a storm, both literal and emotional. The snow lay undisturbed across the grounds, sparkling beneath a pale winter sun. Inside the manor, the atmosphere had shifted. The fear that once gripped every room had softened into quiet resignation. The truth, once spoken, had altered everything. Margaret Whitcomb sat alone in the drawing room, her confession still hanging heavily in the air. She appeared smaller now, stripped of the tension that had sustained her through days of fear. When the authorities arrived at last, delayed but resolute, she offered no resistance. Her voice was steady as she repeated her admission, though tears betrayed the cost of her actions. Miss Marple observed the exchange with a mixture of sympathy and solemn resolve. Confession, she knew, was both an end and a beginning. Eleanor Whitcomb spoke with the officials next. Her role, though not criminal in action, was steeped in moral compromise. She acknowledged her silence, her failure to confront the truth when it mattered most. The weight of generations pressed upon her words. Miss Marple recognized this burden well, the belief that preserving family honor justified almost any sacrifice. It was a belief she had seen destroy lives time and again, that as the household dispersed, the manor seemed suddenly larger, emptier. Christmas decorations remained in place, their cheer muted, but not entirely erased. Miss Marple reflected on how close joy and sorrow often lay, especially during the holidays. Christmas, with its emphasis on unity and forgiveness, had a way of forcing hidden truths into the open. Later, Miss Marple walked through the village of Hazelbrook. Life there resumed cautiously, unaware of the full extent of the drama that had unfolded behind the manor's walls. She exchanged greetings, accepted well wishes, and listened as villagers spoke fondly of traditions that endured despite hardship. It reminded her why she continued to observe, to understand, and occasionally, to intervene. Before her departure, Miss Marple returned once more to the study. The cabinet stood closed now, its contents accounted for, its secrets no longer concealed. She felt no satisfaction in its emptiness, only a quiet acceptance. The past, once acknowledged, lost its power to harm. As she prepared to leave Hazelbrook, Eleanor thanked her, her gratitude tinged with sorrow. Miss Marple responded kindly, reminding her that truth, though painful, was often the only path to peace. Eleanor nodded, understanding at last what denial had cost her family. The train carried Miss Marple away through snow-covered fields, the village fading into the distance. She resumed her knitting, her expression serene. Another mystery had been resolved, not through force or spectacle, but through patience, empathy, and a deep understanding of human nature. Miss Marple reflected on the lesson Hazelbrook had offered. Secrets, especially those wrapped in respectability, were dangerous things. They demanded loyalty, silence, and ultimately, sacrifice. And when exposed, they revealed not only guilt, but the frailty of those who believed themselves beyond consequence. As Christmas approached its end, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Justice had been served, though imperfectly. The truth had been revealed, though at great cost. And in the stillness of the winter landscape, she found a measure of peace. For Miss Marple knew, as she always had, that understanding people, their fears, their hopes, and their weaknesses was the greatest clue of all.